Waiting for the Instagram thing to do its connect. Come on now. There we go. You good?
Yeah.
And here we are for another episode of Dualistic Unity Raw, Christmas Eve edition. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Merry Christmas, Andrew. It's good to see you, buddy. We're going to start this episode basically on Christmas Eve. In a nutshell, just saying that this is an excellent day to just let go of your idea of yourself a little bit more. That's really all it is. It's not about thinking about other people, because then that's thinking about other people for a specific reason, which is really just thinking about yourself. Whereas letting go about your thinking about yourself leaves room for the awareness of other people. And that is such a big part of what makes this holiday, or any holiday that we take seriously, so special, is how much we're willing to let go of ourselves for the sake of that day, for the sake of the experience of that day. And that's exactly what Christmas is, right? Letting go of yourself, being a little bit more giving, a little bit more forgiving, just a little bit more lenient, a little less stressed, right? A little lighter on yourself and others. And that's more of a change in attitude than anything else towards life as a whole. If you are not as afraid of everything happening, then you don't need to think about yourself being in control as much. And so, Merry Christmas to Andrew and our listeners and everybody else who might ever encounter this or never encounter this. Who really gives a shit? But Merry Christmas. And I say this being a person who hated Christmas. I hated Christmas for the longest time. It was a yearly source of pain for me. And now it's not like those memories have gone away. It's because I know that they don't necessarily have to influence the way I choose to feel today. That's also a part of letting myself go.
Yeah, well said. Merry Christmas, man. And it's interesting how we have that capacity to respond to what we're going through or what we're dealing with. Like even the most intense feelings or whatever we're going through, like the assumption even that there's certain ones that shouldn't be happening or certain ones that will not allow you to face certain things or deal with certain things, and how often like so many people go through things that they just like, you don't want to be open about it or talk about it despite the obviousness of it being the case, and how much more free the world could be and empathetic and compassionate if we didn't just go through trying to hide all that shit and suppress all that shit and not feel all that shit, because there's discomfort in it, and there's also the assumption that we're the only one feeling it. Like that, like the amount of like I was fucking like really nervous getting on this call today. It's unreal. And like I've been in situations where it's like there's a fluctuation of a feeling of anxiety or worry or fear. And then as I relax a little bit more, or even as I just, say it, like I'm fucking nervous as shit or anxious or worried or feeling these things or going through this thing, then it's like it subsides in a sense, because so much of it, at least for me, and I did it for so long, like suppressed that and wasn't open about feeling those things, despite when you do start to open up, people start saying like, "No, you go through that. I go through that. Oh shit." And like we don't want to talk about that. I don't know if it's like we're just afraid of it or whatnot, or we think we're alone in it, but it's unbelievable how many ways we have to avoid and suppress and convince not feeling that fucking spectrum of feelings, from the highs to the lows, even in fucking excitement, dude. Like even when people get excited, they try and suppress that because they're like, "Oh, I don't want to feel too excited." It's like, "Oh, you're a jolly one today." It's like, Jesus fucking Christ, why the fuck can't we just like be fucking loose and excited, and then we're feeling the in the pit? It's like we're feeling in the fucking pit. Like when did we become so, and I'm just talking about myself, like so afraid of expressing the extremes of the sides of feelings. Because as soon as you're like, yeah, I'm feeling this stuff. Yeah, I'm going through shit. Yeah, I'm afraid of that. Yeah, I'm afraid of that. I'm worried about that. It's like there's a it's not that they subside necessarily, but the fight subsides, the intensity to the degree of that comes with the assumption that there's something wrong with feeling all that shit tends to settle a bit, and you feel a little bit more connected to everything, and you're not so afraid of like being yourself or putting yourself out there or just sharing shit, because there's this assumption like there's a right and a wrong way to be, right and a wrong way to feel, and those extremes like aren't a component of that, of like the okay things to feel. And it's unbelievable how many ways we have of just like convincing ourselves that we don't feel those things or that there's something wrong with us for doing so.
Yeah, it's complicated. Let's just say I know I had a bit of a lag here. I'm hoping that it's resolved itself. Anyway, because when you look back at when did we learn to resist the extremes of our feelings? It's when there was some kind of a response from the reality around us, right? Like when we're children, for example, we throw tantrums and we tend to hurt other people in doing so. And so reality goes, don't do that. Right. And that's a natural response. So all of a sudden we learn that there are barriers, there are points when we're all of a sudden we're creating an impact that comes back at us. And so we learn through the extremes of our feeling that there are boundaries and that there are other people who have feelings. And while that is a totally natural process, if you were to add egotism onto that, so now the people responding to your outburst are in fact insecure, don't like being uncomfortable, and have a very narrow spectrum of what they can live with, their reaction to you is going to be that much more harsh. And so now instead of you learning a healthy boundary to your emotions, you learn discipline, you learn fear, or you get medicated. Right? You learn you can't act that way, or people are going to get angry at you. There's going to be a consequence. You can't do that. It's against the rules. You're not acceptable. You're not going to fit in. People aren't going to like you. All that stuff, and that's largely just exacerbated by egotism itself. Whereas the natural response to that, the empathetic response to a child throwing a tantrum, is to recognize it and to go through it with them and not take it personally, not to actually vilify the child. But you'd be surprised how many parents do that. Child's throwing a tantrum, there's got to be something wrong with the child, right? Instead of, oh, yeah, we have a wide spectrum of emotions and we don't know how to govern them out the gate. And if our parents don't know how to govern them and they are more rigid and therefore brittle as a result, then our relationships with our parents become more brittle. Our relationships with our parents become a relationship with authority rather than a relationship with somebody also in that spectrum. Right? And so, to answer your question of where did that come from, it came from growing up, but it came from growing up in a society that was less tolerant to the extremes because they've learned to avoid them over time, generationally, through false concepts and control and all of this other fun stuff.
And there's like a lack of wanting to understand it, right? Like whether it's a parent to a child or yourself or a friendship or any relationship, like if say a kid is throwing a tantrum and you don't want to deal with it, you don't want to look at it, you don't want to sit with them, you don't want to understand them, you don't think they have any credence to where that's coming from, despite it just being fucking raw reality going through some stuff that, is what it is, who knows where it comes from. But you just look at the tantrum. It's like you just look at that and you're like, no, don't do that. Or you feel it in yourself and you're like, holy fuck, I'm feeling a lot right now. And it's like, no, don't do that. It's the same fucking thing. It's like the same variation of a response that then you assume that like it's a wrong thing to do. And so then you avoid the, or think there's something wrong with like where that comes from. Cause a tantrum, like maybe it's not as a parent to a kid, you don't fully, especially if you're fucking lost in yourself, you're not going to look at that as being a reasonable response to something. But the intensity of which that kid probably felt that probably did warrant a extreme reaction, but we don't want to look at that because we're not willing to look at it in ourselves, that like we still have the potential for the extremes of that. And holy fuck, dude, like I'm realizing how much like my life, we've been talking about how I felt like it was simpler, easier, whatever. Like I would wake up in the morning and just like do my routines and feel good and like kind of feel good throughout the day. But like there was so much fucking rigidity. I was not relaxed. I was afraid as fuck. But like it was so much feeling of like a further away that I just didn't feel that stuff anymore. But it created a rigidity. And we have certain thoughts about certain experiences and feelings that like we just assume are wrong, and that discounts, the other feelings that we don't discount as wrong. And one of those for me was certainly like I didn't see anything wrong with not being relaxed and being rigid. So like I didn't judge myself for that, despite that being glaringly obvious when I fucking look back at myself. But I did assume that other things were wrong, like being in certain situations and you know whatever, however it played out, like those things were wrong. So then I would balance it with just a rigidity that I didn't see as wrong, because for whatever reason throughout my life went through certain experiences where, I mean, yeah, there were certain things that I perceived to be wrong, but rigidity and lack of relaxation is not seen as wrong at all. It's actually, relaxation is kind of seen as wrong in a lot of ways in our world right now. Like, to relax, there was this assumption that you were not doing enough. You weren't pushing yourself forward enough. It's like, oh, relax. Yeah, I'll relax when I die. I'll sleep when I die. It's like, and this assumption that we can't simultaneously relax and live our lives, like in order, because we're so fucking fixated on getting somewhere, on avoiding all the intensity that is here. And so we must strive, and that reinforces the rigidity. And we must get somewhere else because we've assumed that being here, experiencing the fucking extremes of the spectrum of emotions is wrong. And so then we just create lives that are basically a product or symbolic or an expression of just avoiding being here and the intensity of everything that comes with being here and sitting in whatever you're feeling and working through all that shit telling you there's something wrong for feeling those extremes of that spectrum that exist here.
Well, and it's important to remember that while we're talking about, for example, a parent's response to us, if a parent's response to us is detached and distracted and egotistical and driven towards some end that isn't the connection with the child, then that's going to have an impact. And parents do their best. It's really important to remember that parents do their best. Teachers, the people that you see for an hour a day for maybe a semester and then you never see again, the people who get paid to go in, do a job, and don't really get to know you and can't know you because there's 40 other students in the class, right? Like those people, the ones who just got out of school, freshly graduated, you don't necessarily understand if they're fragile and egotistical either. And that largely depends on how much they need to be looked at as an authority, which depends on how much they grew up with the idea of authority being the point. Right. And so there's a lack of empathy there as well. Now, all of a sudden, there's this idea that you have to learn from them rather than learn with them. And it changes the relationship. And of course, that's going to happen over years and years and years of interacting with stranger after stranger after stranger after stranger, every one of them basically being your guardsman for an hour a day, 5 days a week for a 6-month period or a 4-month period for a semester. And then it rotates to a different guard. And it's just so funny. Then we wonder why these people lash out at us. We wonder why these people judge us or laugh at us or make us feel like we're less. We wonder why, they feel threatened by us, why they feel insecure, because they're just fucking people. They're people. But we have, again, this mentality of separation of authority, of, once you've achieved a certain mentality, you can look down at other mentalities and say, no, that's not correct. You can't act like that. But you'll notice that mentality that thinks that is the most rigid, fragile, controlling mentality, the one that doesn't allow itself to access the full spectrum of emotion, the one that has to have a dictated spectrum that is allowable and justified and controllable. Anything outside of that perspective, according to that mentality, cannot be, because it could do anything. What do we do with that? Isn't that funny? That mentality is the most fragile, and it's the one that must live within the narrowest spectrum. And so this is why I've always advocated for homeschooling. I know not all parents can homeschool, but there are options. There are options. There's also the willingness to admit that perhaps the schooling system through grade school and high school isn't nearly as important as you'd like to believe it is. That the developmental process for a human being is in fact more fundamental than them memorizing the ABCs or learning about trigonometry. Because it's not that those things aren't useful. It's not that those things can't be learned later on in life, but they are certainly not so fundamental that 8 hours of your child's life should be dictated by this shit for 5 days a week throughout its entire life. When that's all time, those are all hours that if they couldn't spend with you, the parent, they could have spent with them. They could have spent learning about themselves. And so this kind of ties into the post that you have on Instagram right now that's going nuts in terms of you making the point that the justification of a chemical imbalance has been used for so very long as a means of giving people antidepressants that it's worth looking at the fact that that justification, that claim is totally unfounded and has been proven to be unfounded. And that is the video that you made. And the anger that you're getting from that is how dare you make this less simple? Because that's what it is. If I look at my mentality as something that's just a matter of topping up my fluids as if I were a car, then that makes me feel a lot more in control. And in that state of control, what I'm trying to do is come to a place where I feel like I'm in control, that the spectrum is manageable, that I don't feel like I'm being overwhelmed. And that's why SSRIs are so very popular. It's because I'm still feeling stuff. Yeah, but you're feeling stuff within a very narrow band that's controllable. It's like, well, when I'm not on them, I feel really low and depressed and whatnot all the time. Yeah, but there's a reason that you do that. There's a reason that you feel like that. And you don't want to look at that reason. And so you'd rather just pump yourself up full of serotonin to maintain a mood that is constantly going to be threatened. So you're constantly going to have this dependence. But the alternative is that it's not a silver bullet, that there is, in fact, work that has to go into this. And I've always said, well, obviously, that's the fact. Otherwise, we'd have no therapists. Right? If it's just a matter of chemicals, then it's medication all the way. And if it's not a matter of chemicals, then there's more to it. And that was the article that you linked in your post, that there is, in fact, more to it. And it gives a wide spectrum of reasons that people go through different mental health issues. It's a fucking great article. But most people never read it. Most people just went off about the fact that you are threatening their justification to live within a narrow box. And that's it. It's like, no, I want to live in here because this is where I'm comfortable. This is where I'm happy. This is where things are good. It's like, right. But in a way that you're always dependent on something, in a way where you're always in danger of something. So, I mean, how good is that really? And the alternative, and what's funny is that you've had people say, well, yeah, I've had to give up my libido, but that's well worth it to maintain my mental health. It's like your relationship's suffering though. So, I mean, how much of this is about your mental health and how much of this is just you not wanting to go through the shit? That would ultimately bring your relationship closer together. But it's this underlying thing that there's no reason I'm feeling this. There's just something wrong with me. It's like, no, there is a reason you're feeling this. Depression has a root. Frustration has a root. Expectation and frustration go hand in hand. Now, if that's the case, then depression has a root as well. And it does. Taking the idea of yourself so seriously that it buries you underneath your own judgment. That's the root. If you can learn from that spectrum by going through it, because what happens when you go through enough time being depressed? Assuming that you don't hold on to the reason that you're being depressed, which is the idea of yourself being having something wrong with you, because that is underlying the foundation of depression. And I know anybody who's listening to this, I've been depressed. I get it. And oh yeah, like a decade. I've been admitted to a psych ward. I've self-admitted to a psych ward. I've been suicidal. I've gone through all of it. I've been on SSRIs. I've been on other medications. I've been on all this shit. I'm not talking about this from some ivory tower where I'm looking down at everyone. I'm talking about this from somebody who's been in the shit, felt drowned by that shit, managed to come up for air, and recognized what the shit was made of. I'm not saying that SSRIs don't have a purpose. What I'm saying is that they're not a silver bullet. What I'm saying is that the justification, or rather what Andrew is saying, is that the justification of a chemical imbalance, an unfounded justification of a chemical imbalance, is not a good reason to take an antidepressant. Especially, and here's the point that I think is most important, for somebody who, if it wasn't for that bullshit diagnosis, probably wouldn't have taken them. How many people would sit on the fence about taking antidepressants until you tell them there's something physically wrong with them? It's like there's an actual imbalance in your brain. Oh, well, shit, then I better take these. How many people were convinced by that bullshit argument? And again, the alternative being not just working on ourselves, because that's, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. No, there's a systemic fucking issue. Like there's a widespread issue in terms of our mentality. In terms of our mentality, which is exactly what you were asking about in terms of learning that spectrum. We learned that spectrum from a rigid mentality that couldn't fucking deal with the extremes of how much we are. So we learned to judge it and medicate it and shut it up out of fear.
And we discount the impact of that collective mentality, of course, because the mentality is reinforcing that nothing's actually connected whatsoever. Like no interactions are really connected. No interactions, like we'll even assume that like an interaction will have influence for sure. And there's a back and a forth, but like kind of not. Like we're kind of just in our own bubble interacting sort of, but they're like we discount the influence over everything and discount like the products of everything, especially fucking like everything we go through growing up, like a world where, you're told that, don't experience those extremes. Like the response to the extremes is just like suppression. And so everything's kind of symbolic of that feeling like like because there's this illusion that we can be in control, it's like that's going to be the epitome of everything. And the extreme of that is just like nothing, like no variations whatsoever. And the maintenance of a life that has no variations and feelings that have no variations and interactions that have no variations, or the potential for a, a different perspective to come into mind based on a potential interaction. Because in that mentality of control, like we're holding so tightly to the idea that this can, like, of my perspective, be it my perspective of myself, be it my perspective of the world, be it my perspective of how other people have to change, but certainly the perspective of myself. And so anything that maybe I interact with, a person, a conversation where it brings that into question, like maybe despite that being the fucking root of so much of the suffering, but then when someone comes around and mentions something that may be an alternate perspective to the idea that you have of yourself that you're reinforcing, despite that being the root, it's like defending our suffering, like defending my perspective that this is correct. That's why we have an aversion if you judge yourself or think you're a worthless piece of shit when someone like, pats you on the back and they're like, hey, you did a great job with that. You assume they're lying. You just straight up assume they're lying because you can't take in the perspective that maybe your perspective of yourself isn't fucking correct. And it just isn't at all. Like you don't know that perspective. Like we maintain one, but like we'll have an aversion, of course, despite, you know, it just not playing out that way in reality. And so in order to fucking maintain that perspective, we stop looking around so much. Like we stop paying attention to reality because that every time we pay attention, it's like bringing into question that perspective that we have because that perspective is shifting. the examples of how it's not correct are happening here. And so we stop paying attention to here so that we can maintain the story that we're telling ourselves, which just reinforces all the shit we're going through and feeling in response to that story and the perspective and all the experiences. Like we were saying in that episode that the clip was from, like, the chemistry stems from the mentality, and then we think that it's the chemistry creating the mentality. But as soon as that comes into question, as soon as we're willing to wonder if, like, maybe the story I've been holding on to isn't correct, maybe the way that I assume this interaction is going isn't how it's going, maybe I can't know how things are going, how I'm doing in life, how I measure up, because I can't know how anyone else measures up. But I'll assume that I do, and I'll trade that. I'll trade that feeling of suppressed numbness, lack of experiencing the ends of that spectrum, the fullness of the experience, for false certainty, for the ability to maintain that story that I have about myself that I hold on to so tightly and must assume that is correct, and which causes me to not want to take in any other considerations. Like, we straight up, it's out there. Like, don't talk about religion and politics in mixed company. Like, don't talk about anything that may bring into question the way that I see the world, because that's uncomfortable. It's like that's like an open thing. Like, oh, don't talk about that. Don't bring that into question. It's like that's a thing that brings into question your perspective, because there's other fucking considerations out there. There's always other considerations, which is why it's so important to be able to have conversations and to be willing to look at alternate perspectives of things and where someone's coming from with something. And maybe the truth that I'm holding on to, the certainty that I'm holding on to, isn't as true or as certain as I'd like to believe.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. But I want to believe. Right? And this is the response that we get from everybody. You're threatening my simplicity. You're threatening how simple this is. I just need this, and this will fix me, and this is it. It's just a fix. But it's like, what if life isn't that simple? What if it's not? What if it's not getting to a point in your life where adult equals stressed? What if that's not the trajectory? Because that's what we're talking about, is that by the time you're a fully functioning adult in society, fitting in, you have to live within a very narrow spectrum, and you have to feel a very narrow spectrum of feelings, and anything outside of that spectrum of feelings is a disorder and rejected by everyone. That's a really tough mentality to justify, but it leads to a lot of our problems. And that's all you're really saying. And I think it's interesting because, and I understand from, again, my own experience, I wouldn't have liked what you said in that video when I was on antidepressants, because I really wanted it to be something that was easily addressed. Despite how hard it was, like, I was still going through it. At least I was on antidepressants. This was going to level me out. I could still go to work. I could still get things done. My relationships didn't suffer as much. Do you see how it's all about the impact on others? It's about the impact on the control that I have in my life. It's all about just continuing on. It's not in any way about addressing the fucking issue. Right? Because I didn't want to admit there was an issue. I didn't want to look at the fact that how I thought was contributing to my depression, how I believed I existed in the world, was a mentality that contributed to depression being an option, being a possibility. And I know immediately somebody who's depressed is going to be like, well, depression is always a possibility. Yeah, it is, when you take yourself super seriously. And I know that sucks to hear, especially if you're in the middle of depression. I get it. You don't want to admit that you're taking yourself super seriously, but on the other hand, you don't want to stop thinking about yourself as being depressed. And that's going to keep you in place, because as long as you think that you're depressed, you're going to remain in depression. No, that's not the only reason, but it is definitely a contributing factor. All of the other stories you tell yourself are the reason. All the other pressure you put on yourself is the reason. All the other assumptions of how people see you is the reason. All of the other assumptions about your about your potential and your worth and your value and your future, that's the reason. But telling yourself that you're depressed is certainly not helping, because then you're just believing one more fucking fiction about yourself that's keeping you underneath the pressure of all of that. Because if you're depressed, there's got to be a path out of it. There's got to be a hard journey out of it. And it's not that that's not true, but in seeing it that way, it actually makes you less effective in doing anything about it right now. Because you'll always do less than you can if you're perceiving some giant mountain to climb over in the long run. But if you understand that depression comes from overinvesting in the mentality now, that it can be let go of now, not forever, now. It'll be back as soon as you invest in that mentality again. And it's not about just black and white. Oh, now I'm not in it. Now I am. It can become like that. But over time, it's existing within the spectrum of gray in between. But if you are truly depressed, if you are truly unhappy, then every lessening of that darkness is fucking worth it. And that's what we're saying, is that you can crawl out of the depression. You can crawl out of this pressure in just understanding where it comes from. In just understanding that there are certain thoughts, that there are certain things that you can invest in, certain beliefs that will, in fact, reinforce it. But that you are strong enough, that you can get through it. See, that's all you're saying, man, is that, if it's not an imbalance, then maybe there's more to the argument. That's all we've been saying this whole time. People are lashing out like, you're saying SSRIs have no purpose whatsoever. What about extreme cases of this and that and this and that? And you're just saying, what we're saying, though, is, the basis that it's based on something wrong with the chemicals in your brain is unfounded. That doesn't mean that they don't serve some purpose or have some benefit. Fuck, having a beer after dinner has some benefit. Like that's not really the point. The point is that if somebody comes up to you and says you must have a beer after dinner, otherwise you won't digest correctly, that doesn't have a benefit, because that's certainly not true.
Yeah, exactly. Because if and again, it's not to say that there isn't there aren't times and places for these things, of course, but, like, all it was about was that the chemical imbalance theory has never been proven. Like, it's never which I think a lot of people are, relying upon that as being the thing and the reason because, like, the chemical imbalance just reinforces that there's something inherently wrong with you. Like, there is something unchangeable, nothing you can do about it whatsoever. It's just what you are, who you are, not able to change at all. And we see that in a lot of variations, like mentioned in the clip, like, the assumption that the way God made you is just the way you are. And it's like we discount the influences and impacts that we interact with throughout our lives that, create this whole narrative and story about ourselves. Like we discount that there was a bunch of shit that happened. Like you were impacted by everything throughout your entire life. Like everything going on, happening has, led to a certain thing. Like you were quote unquote created by yourself interacting with the world and yourself. And then it just becomes this sort of convenient thing that you want to assume that you are. It's like, yeah, this is who I am, this is what I am, but it's not even like the actions is what I am. It's just the story. The story I tell myself is what I am, because the alternative is being left in uncertainty without so much of that narrative and story. And when you said, you know, letting go isn't forever, it's just now. Like that's the point. Like holy fuck, the amount that I assume that it's something more than that, like letting go of feelings or experiences, like, oh, if it's gonna come back, it's not worth it. And it just reinforces this whole thing that like, no, I can't let go of this now. And then because then it would discount, all of the investment that I had in it. And it's like reinforces it as it goes, but it's not letting go of it forever. Like I think I've been really, really assuming that like, oh, this is gonna be a thing that's forever. Like, forever doesn't exist outside of here. And, like, the assumption that something's gonna be fixed or solved or figured out in the future is just kicking it down, like kicking the can down the road. And there's an intensity to like letting go of that barrier, wall, all of it, but without so much of that idea that it can't be let go of now. And again, like not forever, just right now is reinforcing that it's got to be maintained and got to be held on to. And like, because if it's something that can only happen, will only happen at some point in the future after I do all of these things, like it'll never be arrived at. Like it'll never be dealt with or looked at. And then it'll cause us to be confused in a sense because we're waiting for it to change and shift, but it's based on this assumption that it's going to happen somewhere else that isn't right now. But like it's the only place it can happen. Like it's the only spot that it can happen, and not with the assumption that it's going to be necessarily maintained either, because that then reinforces that it's, it can't happen right now if it's got to be maintained forever, because then it's on a timeline and a spectrum, and there's the ability to judge yourself for, not lasting more than 3 right nows or 3 moments or whatever. It's like, no, right now, still right now.
But again, it's a skill. It's a skill, right? Like we've talked about how certain thoughts only exist in certain states of tension. That the more you relax, the less those thoughts exist within your awareness. It's not that they're not there. You could easily access them by just tensing up. But when you're not as tense, you don't have the same thoughts. When you're not judging yourself, for example, or rather, when you're not caring whether you're judged, you don't have as many judgmental thoughts. So it really depends on your level of tension to a very large degree. Now, that is important to recognize now. Are you tense or are you relaxed? Because before you try to address anything in terms of your thoughts, that's the underlying foundation. It's like I was saying before. You can't try to get something done while you're also stressing out about whether or not you're going to get it done. That makes it very difficult. Your attention's immediately split in half, right? And so, are you tense or are you relaxed? It's a great place to start. But if you don't know how to relax, then even if you move towards relaxation, you're moving a little bit towards relaxation. Right? So it's a skill that develops over time. But as a parent, it's something that you want to teach your children. So for example, when your kid is throwing a tantrum, it's not about punishing them. It's about working through it with them and bringing them to a state where they relax. We see often people look at a kid throwing a tantrum and they go, well, there's something wrong behaviorally. They're not behaving properly. It's like, well, they're tense. That's why they're throwing a tantrum. They're stressed about something. There's something underlying that is making that extreme happen. Because when they're not tense and they're not freaking out, right? When they're not trying to grab hold and have control and get their way and get to a certain end result, they don't act like that. So this is something that we can be taught very young. And some people are. I mean, some people are raised in environments where that's exactly what they're learning. They do have that time to reflect. They do have that time to calm the fuck down. But a lot of times, as we're going through school, you throw a tantrum, your teacher doesn't have time to deal with you in an empathetic fashion. You get detention. You get ridiculed in class. You get singled out and put in the corner. You get all that shit, right? And so there's no degree of calming down. And this is why a lot of kids, like, when you have no say in your life, like when you have to go through something where nobody's listening to you, nobody's paying attention to you, nobody is offering you any way out, you have no solution whatsoever, what do? You tune the fuck out. You tune out. And this is why a lot of kids develop things like ADHD. This is why a lot of kids start to disassociate, right? Is because they're given no option. They can't express how they feel about the life that they're living because that wouldn't be fitting within that life. That wouldn't be acceptable to anybody around them, and they have to go to that environment. They have to live within that mentality. They have to live with these kids and these teachers. They have to fit into it. So they're given no option except to keep going and tune out, and finally fucking medicate so that way they can keep going and tune out. And we don't see that this has just become the norm. We don't understand that because we are so tense, because we are so desperate to survive, because we are going through so much shit. Right? We just want to feel better. We want to feel better. I want somebody to go, yes, there's something wrong with you, and this is how to fix it. rather than going, no, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just super tense about a lot of reasons that you think are justifiable, but are in fact total fucking fiction. And nobody, well, not nobody, but very few people want to listen to that unless they've gone through it the hard way, like I did, of being medicated, of looking at that silver bullet, of praying desperately to the gods of therapy to save me, right? Until finally I just went, it's on me. It's on me, and it's on me to look at the thing I don't want to look at, which is my sense of self. Right? That's it. I don't want to look at the fact that I'm holding on to a sense of who I am to feel in control of a life that is ultimately uncertain, so I can measure my value and measure my progress and compare myself to my assumptions of others. And it's all one mentality that leads to fucking depression. And yet when you look at that and I go, no, depression is a medical issue. Somebody is currently making the point that, there are biological influences. Like, yeah, biological influence, sure. There is definitely evidence to show that there is some genetic memory in terms of how our ancestors responded to reality. There is definitely some biological influence, but that doesn't take away the fact that you still have influence over how you think. It would be like saying you're prone to alcoholism, right? Well, then, just don't drink or be super responsible when you drink. But if you're prone to depression, then just don't take yourself so seriously. It's the same kind of drug. See, what you're saying doesn't disregard what we're saying. It doesn't, just because there are genetic factors, just because there are biological influences that might make you more predisposed towards depression, doesn't imply that you don't have a say. It just implies that there are certain mentalities that you should be super careful about. There are certain investments in how you think about yourself that you should be super careful about. In the same way that someone prone to alcoholism should be super careful about having a drink.
And we're not taught that at all. Like, we're taught the opposite. Like, we're taught to focus on ourself, not take ourselves so seriously. And so many things like reinforce how seriously we take ourselves and like the feelings and like, I can remember younger in school, like getting in trouble and like we had minors and majors and like getting a major and like the intensity of the like having to get sent to the principal's office and like as someone who was very afraid of doing shit wrong, that like I'm maybe talking about one of the roots of that was like, oh my God, the intensity, like it felt like, and I think I was 6 or 7 maybe, like the intensity of like the world closing in, like feelings of darkness and shame, and it was just like it just like fucking suppressed me, and that was, probably a point where, the response is to tense up. It's like, "Oh my god, that's a lot," and you did something wrong. You're doing something bad, and like, I'm probably lucky and fortunate that I only have a couple, but it's still like the same because there's people who fucking, go through that fucking every day. Like, holy fuck, and the amount of weight and tension that comes with that and that response, like, no wonder we walk around tense as shit all the time. Like, no wonder we're looking around trying to find the right thing to do and the right way to act and the right way to feel. Because like, in a situation like that, the intensity of that, and then it's equated with being wrong or being incorrect or there being something wrong with you, like the desire to keep ourself in control, which requires me to maintain a perspective of myself that I know. It's like, oh my God, the intertwined nature of like the stories we tell ourselves and the things we go through and the feelings and like I certainly discounted how fucking intertwined, like, when we first started talking, I was like, "Oh, yeah, it's your, conceptual idea of yourself. It's not, you're not what you think," but there's so much to that. It's like I'm looking at the fucking little tip of the iceberg, and it's like, dude, there's a fucking massive iceberg under that. And it's all reinforcing this assumption that like we can't just be ourselves, like we can't just let go and show up. Just show up to a situation and be you. Don't have to prep, don't have to prepare, don't have to look around, don't have to see what anyone else is doing. But like the amount of times we go round and round and round with that throughout, growing up, that it's just like, nope, can't do this. Nope, can't show up there. Nope, can't be relaxed here. Nope, can't be yourself here because you were being yourself there. And this is, something bad that you did. That's just a reflection and just symbolic of everyone else going through the same fucking thing. That's the same root over and over and over and over, based on this fiction of there being a right or wrong way, or the fiction of you, like the fiction that narrative that you've built over time is you. But oh my God, it comes with so much and so many assumptions about certain things. And that's probably why and of course I go through fluctuations of emotions, but it's like it's not conceptual. It's still, I'm holding on to assumptions that certain, feelings or situations or responses to certain feelings in certain situations is wrong, is incorrect. And it's not just a narrative, like it's what everything that's being felt or experienced right now. And then it's like the thoughts are just kind of like the thing I see or hear, but it's coming from something so much deeper, but it's still just the thoughts in a sense. Yeah.
Like I said, it's something we learn over a lifetime. We don't even recognize how much, because it's hard for us to look back at our life and remember day after day after day after day of going through school. Do you remember how many days went by? Because after enough years, it just starts to seem like that's just all you're doing. It's 5 days on, 2 days off, maybe, right? 5 days on, 2 days off, maybe. Not to mention extracurriculars, not to mention, homework assignments, not to mention all of that other fun stuff, right? And not only are you in school for that, but you're also dealing with all of your friends who are going through school the rest of the time. So it's not like you're outside of that mentality then either, right? And this is where children really learn to ridicule and really learn how to tear people down. It's because they themselves need to prop themselves up. Where do you think they get that assumption? Right? It's reinforced by the system. You got an A. You got a C. You behaved correctly. You get a gold star. That whole thing. And so there's this comparative mentality that we're just ingrained with over time, right? And so all of that time, we're learning new thoughts and ideas about ourselves. Every time we learn something new about the world, we have to have a thought about ourselves within it, right? And over time, it just becomes this massive iceberg, as you said, right? And so somebody asked a great question here. How does a person who takes themselves too seriously not do that? That's a great question. And it's not a silver bullet kind of answer, because I could just say, well, just don't take yourself so seriously. But so a big part of this, and somebody else answered, I would start with questioning, one question at a time. And that's a great way to do it, right? It's a great way to do it. Is that so when you think to yourself, oh my God, I'm such a piece of shit. This person definitely doesn't like me. Stop. Do you know that? Do you know any of those things? Are you sure? And more importantly, are you sure, even if the person doesn't like you, of why they don't like you? So questions are a great way to start, because at least then what you're doing is, instead of settling on the false certainty of this is definitely happening and this is definitely who I am, you're willing to take it a little less seriously and go, well, maybe. And you do that layer by layer by layer, and the whole thing starts to unravel over time. Now, there's a catch-22 here, or rather a caveat that I want to add, that if you start with questioning, don't make questioning the point. And the reason I say that is because then you're going to feel compelled to always be questioning. There's going to come to a point where you just stop making assumptions. So if you're not making as many assumptions, you don't always have to be questioning them, because you're not making them. Right? So eventually the point of the questioning is to just relax and be where you are. But the questioning is a good place to start, because usually what you're questioning are your justifications for being tense, which are your assumptions that you are out of control or can be in control. And that's it. Just relax. But understanding those mechanisms makes a world of difference. But it's a process. Again, it's not a black and white thing, though it does happen now. You can go from a state of being super tense to just laughing at yourself and feeling the absurdity wash over you. You can do that. And then 2 seconds later, get tense again. And it's important to recognize that it's always going to be that way. It's always going to be there. But that you can learn to feel the current and understand that relaxation has depth in the same way that your tension has depth. But it's like, you're working through all the tension to get to the relaxation, and then you get to the relaxation and you can still keep going. There's a whole other world to be experienced there. And then on that side of things, life changes entirely. But a big part of what we're digging through is that layer of tension, which is the belief that tension pays off, the belief that we can be in control, that our value can be measured, that we can know how we're doing.
Well said. Because for me, it is questioning oftentimes, but like there does get to a point where that becomes a maintenance of tension too, because the questioning is conceptual still. Like it's still thoughts that I'm having. And so and I still go back and forth, because then sometimes I'll be questioning and I'll be questioning, the questioning will just fall on one side or the other. But a lot of it, like I was very easily able to maintain a fuckload of tension while questioning things and maintaining the idea that there was a right and a wrong still, in a sense. Like, and I go through that still all the time, but it does get to a point where it's like, just fucking relax. Like you're feeling a lot of stuff. Yeah, you're feeling a lot of stuff. And if you can fucking laugh at yourself, like if you can't laugh about, because you're not feeling the good feelings, the comfortable feelings, you can laugh at yourself for being so fucking afraid or worried or taking yourself so goddamn seriously. And so much of it stems from that. And I think, oh God, and this is like, part of me is like hesitant even to bring it up, but like we talked a couple days ago about being a vessel, and like ultimately recognizing that, like, as much as it's questioning and relaxation, it also comes down to your actions in a fuckload of ways. And like that was hitting me really hard yesterday. And it's fucking relaxing. It's freeing, because it's like you're not even maintaining so much of a perspective of yourself. You're just the interaction. You're just what's going on, and you are that vessel. But like, I don't know. I was thinking like, oh, how do I this insight? How do I make a fucking video about that? Like, the fucking selfishness that that I experience, that we maintain, like the assumption, like, because there's an underlying assumption of selfishness that is, I don't know, the antithesis of being a vessel is like straight up kind of giving up yourself in a sense. And it's like, part of me is like talking about it now, and I'm like, there's gonna be fucking, I feel blowback from it, because there's like a resistance to that I feel like, holy fuck, giving up yourself. That's because that's your assumptions. It's your assumptions, your opinions, your preferences. And then I was like, and then I'm like, there's gotta be a balance between it. But like when I'm feeling it, there isn't, it's the draw comes with the intent. Like, it's not to say it's not intense there, but the weight of maintaining me in a lot of ways, as opposed to, letting myself go. Like, letting yourself go isn't just an idea. And this is, I wanted to get to, I'm glad we're getting to this, because like the actions that you do, like thinking about yourself is not just a thought. It's like the way you live your fucking life. It's how you live your life. And reinforce each other. So like the actions that you take and like will inevitably impact that. And I don't think we want to look at that. Like part of me does not. I'll be quite honest. Part of me does not want to look at that. And and I'm seeing that it's like, well, that's selfish as fucking. And yet there's this sort of assumption, like growing up, living our lives, that sort of thinking about yourself, prioritizing how you feel, and then your actions are a response to how you feel. So you're feeling a certain way, just, get this thing for yourself. Do this thing for yourself. Do this thing to make yourself feel better. Live your life for you. You got to live for you. You got to live for you. And like that is so fucking deep that the thought that no, actually freedom is found when you're not living your life for yourself, like almost at all. And I wanted to bring, because like now I'm like, how the fuck do you balance like living for you, but living for quote unquote everyone? And as I'm saying it, it's like the perspective of there being everyone. There's less of even a thought of there being a difference so much. And so that's been, I don't know, like I've never fucking come across this, but I'm realizing just how much that perspective. And then it's like, as I'm saying, living for you is living for you. It goes the other spectrum, the other end of it goes hand in hand as well. Like living for yourself from an egotistical perspective isn't actually living for yourself. It's like living for everyone else and how yourself is viewed by quote unquote everyone else. So they are kind of both sides go hand in hand, and it's not really living for you from the selfish perspective. And then it's just like which perspective, like what do you mean by you?
But that's the question. What do you mean by you? Because that's the transition. Do you mean the idea of you, in which case you're always going to be trying to solve a problem that's not there, soothe the lack that's not there, build up a value that's not measurable, try to be more in a way that you can't be? Like as soon as you're invested in the conceptual you are invested in hell, essentially. And the more you let go of the conceptual you, the more you are just being yourself, which is everything else. See, that's the thing. The concept separates you from being what you are. Everything stops you from experiencing life that way. And so it's so heavy because it's so enclosed by fictional walls. So when we say live for you, that doesn't mean the conceptual you. This is why the manifestation thing took such a fucking side turn, right? Is because everybody's just like, I can manifest anything I want. It's like you should be questioning what you want. You should be questioning why you want it. Why don't you feel enough? Because most of that shit's about making more money. Most of that shit's about getting a new car, about getting a new house, about manifesting a desired end result, rather than the ongoing process of changing the impact that you have on your life. Right? So it really just comes down to what's your focus? Is your focus the fiction that creates lack? In which case, that's all your attention is going to be on. Or is your focus being where you are? Right? Which is not a fictional thing. It's not a conceptual thing. There's no sense of control in that, but there is a fuck ton of empathy and sensitivity for things as they happen. But that means that you just have to go through your life one moment at a time. We don't like that. It's just like, well, what's my path going to be? It's going to unravel. See, that's the funny part. We always talk about this. Like, you don't know what's best for you. If you were to get what you wanted when you were 10 right now, you'd be extremely fucking disappointed. And it's because it doesn't currently suit your mentality. So why are you trying to project what you want in 5 years from a mentality you have now? Outside of a sense of control. Because I guarantee for you doing that, because of the conceptual you. Well, then have this, then I'll be worth this, then life will be like this. You don't know any of that. But you do know how you feel right now. And you feel like you're not enough unless you get that house. You feel like you're not enough unless you get that thing. You feel like you're not enough unless people look at you a certain way. You feel like you're not enough, blah, 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 all of which is fucking optional.
Well said. And like it all ties together. Like the thought of knowing what's best for you in 5 years, or the assumption, of course, is going to reinforce your perspective, whatever that perspective is of everything. And so how much that's thought about as like a good thing to do, and it's like every time, like, that's such a wild thing to do, but it makes sense when there's an underlying assumption that I can be in control, that I can have control, that I can know something. Like, I can know that. It's like, yeah, but you're gonna experience, like, almost 2,000 days between now and then. Like, what is that? Like 20, 40, 50,000 hours? 50,000 hours between now and that arbitrary point you've picked. Like, how many fucking, like, you break it down to seconds, it's like, that's a lot of potential shifts in perspectives and mentality. So, with the maintenance of the perspectives, like, we're going up against a lot of potential for change. And when you start to break that down, it's like, it's almost like the change in myself, in reality, doesn't seem quite so daunting when you start to see all of the potentials for it in a point. Like, people are able to maintain a perspective of the right way to live their life and just continue through it, discounting all of the potentials to shift and change and blah, 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 blah. It's like, no wonder we're so tense, because we're looking at a point. It's like, it's like all these things happening, and we're just trying to maintain a straight line to the future and discounting all of the potential shifts, all of the potential differences in ways that we see ourselves. So we hold on to that perspective of ourselves like it's a fucking flotation device as we're trying to, swim in a straight line through the ocean, instead of just being willing to learn how to swim and like take the currents where they go. Because if you go with the current, like, how hard is it to fight a current? It's pretty fucking difficult, pretty damn tough. And so no wonder, oh my god, like, because if you pick a point, say like 5 miles down through the ocean, and like every time there's a wave or a shift and you are maintaining this, say hypothetically you were able to draw a line in the ocean, like, you get swayed from that. It's like, that's reality happening, but that gap is going to be you thinking that you're doing something wrong. There's something wrong with you because you're in this spot, feeling this thing, going through this thing, experiencing this thing that doesn't match where you think you should be experiencing it. It doesn't match your thoughts about what you think should be happening, how you think something should be going. And it's like that sway. And so we fight that. And so we're feel like we're able to maintain that line, but it comes with a fuckload of rigidity, because being relaxed is letting go of that point and just be in the fucking ocean, like, being the currents, the shifts, because there's no resistance to that, but we resist that because we're maintaining a perspective of there being a right or wrong way to act, to feel, to live life, to do anything.
Fuck, you just nailed it too. That's exactly what the fucking difference is that there is a difference in perspective. If you think that you are the conceptual you, then you're holding on to that life raft on top of the current, desperately trying not to drown, never realizing that you were never the life raft. You're the whole fucking current. You can't drown. It's all your own fear that's influencing the choices that you make. It has nothing to do with the environment itself and everything to do with your perception in it. And that is the problem with the idea of depression. Oh God, I'm going through depression. It's like you're going through yourself. That's what you're doing. You're going through yourself. More importantly, you're going through a perspective of yourself amidst fucking infinite numbers. So the question isn't why am I going through this, but why am I dwelling on it? Why am I getting caught in it? And it's because of that allure of certainty. It's because of that temptation to want to think that who you think you are is actually who you are. That's why it keeps sucking you in. The more seriously you take yourself, the more likely you're going to become depressed. And before depression comes anxiety, right? And before anxiety, there's desire. You've got to have more, right? And all of that is rooted in yourself. Because when you can't get enough, all of a sudden now you're afraid that you're not enough. And you go through that long enough, you start to feel like you're always going to be afraid. And now you're fucking doomed. And that's your depression. And it's a downward spiral that starts with how you think about yourself. It starts with thinking about yourself, in fact, and taking that too seriously. Because you can have thoughts about yourself, understanding that they're not really about you. Right? They're about perspectives of you. They're about possible facets of you, but they're never about you because you are never one thought. You can't be. But that was beautifully said. That's exactly the difference. We feel like we are the victim to the tide rather than the tide itself. And so we resist the fury and the strength of the tide, not realizing it's our strength. And so we feel so small and so disempowered. And it's simply because we just don't know how to just be that strength. We keep trying to fight it. We keep trying to get control rather than understanding, like, there's already something happening. Just go with it. There's already something happening. Just go with it. But instead, you're like, but I don't like it. I don't understand it. I don't know where it's going. I'm going to think about myself. I'm going to think about how to get out of this. And the entire time, you're just getting sucked into the current, into the current. That's you thinking that somehow you're being the victim to that current. And it's only because you're fighting the change that you're going through. You're actually fighting the progress that you've made up until this point because suddenly it doesn't feel very good. But as Andrew knows, and I know very personally, that the more you question yourself, the more you willingly walk into uncertainty, the more you're going to experience things you're like, whew, that's a lot, and have the temptation to go, and therefore it's bad. And therefore this is a bad sign. This is not good. This is a lot. It's intense. I don't know if I can take this. And immediately you start to think about yourself because that temptation's always there. And as always, so is the option to relax here and now. This has been a lot of fun. I want to mention to everybody that we have a Patreon group today. It's Christmas Eve. We're still doing our Patreon group. You can join us on patreon.com/dualistic unity. There's a tier 2 and a tier 3 call today. Just because we love to connect with the community and chat about all of this fun stuff. I am going to recommend this episode to everybody who's currently commenting on your video about the chemical imbalance because it's a good episode. It covers a lot of stuff. If you are one of the people who has an issue with what I'm saying and how I'm saying it, do remember, I don't care. And it's not necessarily that I don't care about your point. I respect that you have a point. And if I haven't heard that point, sweet, awesome. But more often than not, the comments that we're getting on the video are actually the reason the video was made. So we're getting the question like, why aren't you listening to all these people's point of view? And it's actually the point of view that the video was made to address. So it's not that we're not listening to you. The video is your answer. The video is your response. So watch the video. And if you don't like the video, watch the podcast it references or read the article. Either way, I'm not going to say this in a way that you're necessarily going to like because there is no way that I can say this to you in a certain mentality that you're going to like. None. Oddly enough, there's a mentality so steeped in its idea of itself that it actually resists empowerment because it is invested in the mentality that demands it think about itself as disempowered. And so telling somebody you can do this is oddly enough going to be a threat to them in a mentality when they must believe that they can't. Otherwise, the alternative is that they don't know, and that's terrifying. So I don't give a shit if you like how I'm saying it, is what I'm saying. I'm saying it because honestly, it's honesty. And the fact is it's the exact thing that I wouldn't have wanted to hear when I was going through it myself.
Yeah, well said. And yeah, excited for Patreon in about 20 minutes. It's gonna be a lot of fun. But this has been it's been a blast. It's so funny. Like every time I go into one of these, like not really. I figured given the the comments and everything on that video, we dig into this, but like it's kind of what we're always talking about in some variation, some way, shape, or form. And it's fascinating how many things that we do that just reinforce the same sort of thing, and we'll pin it as, like the assumption that something or getting something or getting somewhere makes me more, and reinforce, like, it's immediately on a spectrum. So as you invest in something and feel good about getting that thing, or thinking that it makes you more, or the thought that something else makes someone else more, the assumption that you can be anything other than just what you are, like, it's reinforcing the downfalls of everything, the pitfalls. And then there's the assumption that you're less because of something, but it's kind of maintained. I mean, they both maintain each other. The assumption one way or the other that, oh, someone else doing something in a certain way or living a certain way must be like, that means they're more. It's like, it's still just your assumption, because we can't even know anyone else's experience. And so with uncertainty, like, it's way harder to maintain the perspective of being more or being less when you're willing to just look at that. But again, as we've been talking about, like, it's reinforced by so many things that we do, choices that we make, decisions that we make, things that we go through, and assumptions that come with them. But then oftentimes the things that we choose to do are in response to the ways that we feel. That's like this vicious cycle. And at some point, you got to be willing to just let go of the assumption that the feeling that you're feeling is something that has to be responded to, and therefore fixed with a certain action or response. Like, the buck has to stop at some point for a vicious perpetual cycle that reinforces itself to stop. And maybe part of that is your assumptions of the things, the ways that you act, the things that you do, letting go of the assumption that there's anything ever wrong with that, because then that'll change your responses and your actions that you take throughout your life.
And it's no more complicated than not taking something to heart that you normally would have taken on, say, Christmas Day, because it's Christmas Day. So suddenly somebody says something to you on Christmas and normally would piss you off, but you're like, it's Christmas, I'll let it go. Doesn't have to be Christmas. You can just let it go. Then it feels like Christmas, which is why Christmas doesn't have to be just on one day. It can be your whole mentality. Speaking of which, we have a Christmas special coming out tomorrow. Looking forward to it. It is a movie review / Christmas special of It's a Wonderful Life. If you haven't checked out It's a Wonderful Life, go and check out the movie It's a Wonderful Life. It's a great day to do it. Tomorrow is also a great day to do it, but it kind of gives you a perspective of what we're talking about here. In fact, we're going to sign off here in a minute. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody in the community. This is our third Christmas on Dualistic Unity. I'm very excited about that. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the upcoming events. Virginia Beach, February 1st, April 11th in California. And then we've got other stuff coming as well. Tickets are available, all that fun stuff. But if we can see you on Patreon shortly, great. If not, happy holidays. Have a fantastic new year, and we will see you soon.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to everyone, and I look forward to chatting with some of you on Patreon.